On the high ground east of the French city of Arras, the Point du Jour marks one of the highest points on this landscape of 1917. Here, attacks by British, Scottish and South African troops marked one of the greatest advances in the history of trench warfare up to that date. But as always, it was sacrificial ground on the killing fields of Arras. This week we find ourselves back on the rolling chalk downland around the northern French city of Arras. This is where the Battle of Arras was fought in April and May of 1917, perhaps one of the lesser-known British and Commonwealth battles of the Great War. But considering this was one of the deadliest British battles of that conflict, with on average over 4,000 British and Commonwealth casualties every single day, a casualty rate higher than the Somme and Third Ypres, it should be a much better known battle and recognised part of the old front line, especially so since it had been part of the British sector since 1916. The British Army after the Battle of Loos saw a change of command, and gradually during that year of 1915 the growing size of the British Expeditionary Force meant that they could extend their line further south from Flanders across northern France and getting nearer and nearer to the city of Arras. And with a change of command from Sir John French being the original commander of the BEF, who was sacked after the Battle of Loos, and Sir Douglas Haig then took over and remained as commander-in-chief for the rest of the war, the British in 1916 agreed to extend their line even further, and the sector around Arras was taken over, and the ground between Arras and the Somme, with the British line eventually resting on a join with the French army close to the River Somme, and that of course is where the Battle of the Somme was fought in 1916. But from a British soldier's perspective, Arras was very much in their grid square in terms of their experience, because many of the units that served on the Somme in 1916 had taken over parts of the Arras front from the French during that early period, and many units that then served in the Battle of the Somme were sent up to Arras during that year after having been in action, because Arras was considered a quiet sector at that particular point in the conflict. But pretty rapidly it becomes an important part of the BEF's line on the Western Front, an important part of the soldiers' experience in that British sector of the Western Front. And by the end of the war, if a soldier had fought at Ypres or the Somme or many other of those great battlefields of the British and Commonwealth experience of the Great War on this landscape of the Western Front, then it's quite likely they served at Arras. It was just as important as those other sectors. But over the years, Arras has kind of been forgotten. Its symbolism in that conflict has kind of been forgotten, and it's probably the least written about part of the Western Front and the Battle of Arras of 1917 until John Nicholls' book in the 1990s, Cheerful Sacrifice. There was no single volume history of the fighting in Arras in 1917 apart from the official history. The other strange thing as to why Arras isn't as well known as some of those other places is its proximity, really. Its proximity to the Channel ports and the Eurotunnel. So it means in terms of exploring that modern landscape of the Western Front around Arras, Arras is a very accessible battlefield to get to. You can be there in around about an hour from the Channel Tunnel. It's got a whole host of places to stay and places to eat, so it kind of ticks all the boxes in terms of the modern visitor to these battlefields. So over the years of visiting this area myself, I've always wanted Arras to have more attention. I've taken a lot of battlefield tours to Arras. I wrote myself a guidebook to the Arras area, Walking Arras, which was published by Pen and Sword in the 90th anniversary of the Battle of Arras in 2007. And here on the podcast, because this battle and battlefield have been a long favourite area of mine to visit, because of the many veterans that I knew who took part in this 1917 battle, we have travelled to Arras before, of course, but there's still much for us to find around the Arras area. And it was good recently to see JD Hutt's History Underground channel on YouTube do a whole video series on the battlefields at Arras, inspired by some of the episodes of this Old Frontline podcast. JD is a great supporter of the podcast and very kindly often shares details of what we do with his vast audience of people on YouTube, and his videos on Arras are very much worth checking out, so make sure you do that, and I'll put a link to his series onto the podcast website so you can find them. So in this walk around Arras, we're going to focus on one area of the battlefield where the front lines had been pretty much static since 1914, when the French and Germans had clashed in that first year of the war, but where on the 9th of April 1917, the first day of the Battle of Arras, there was an incredible advance on the scale of such advances in the history of trench warfare. So, let's strap on our virtual boots, pick up our virtual pack, and head out onto that landscape of the Great War around the city of Arras as we head to the Point du Jour. In this walk, we're going to cover a bit of ground on the battlefields around Arras, roughly east-northeast of the city, in an area where one of the great advances on the 9th of April 1917 took place, between the villages of Saint Laurent and Athies, and then we'll carry on to the high ground which the units advancing here in 1917 were heading towards at a place called the Point du Jour. That's roughly translated the break of day. It's a high point on the battlefield where I guess before the war you could stand there and watch the sun rise early in the morning, just as you can do today, and just as I'm sure many soldiers experienced during the Great War, men of both sides. So where are we? Where do we begin our walk? I've put a map of this walk again onto the podcast website for you to use, where in between the village of Saint Laurent, where the front line was established in 1914, when French and German troops fought in the area around Arras, and there was a standstill, there was a stalemate, an impasse, and both sides dug in. And the front line here, while there was fighting around Arras in 1915, this was more of a quiet sector, and the front stabilised, and most of the trench positions here didn't move much. There was quite a lot of underground warfare in the sectors around Arras, localised actions, but nothing on the scale of Notre Dame de Lorette and Hill 145 Vimy Ridge, where the French were fighting in the battles of Artois of 1915. And Saint Laurent was the very front line. So where we're standing now, which is underneath a railway bridge between these two villages of Saint Laurent and Athies, this was, at the beginning of the Battle of Arras, behind the German lines, and the railway that's running here is the line that runs today from Arras to Lens, and it ran the same routes before 1914, but of course during the war no trains running there, and at different points the Germans had utilised that railway line as part of their defences. There were deep cuttings that they could use, there were dugouts in the side of those, and you see many photographs of the Germans using them in those early years of the First World War. And the sector where we are, on that 9th of April 1917, the first day of the Battle of Arras, was the responsibility of the 9th Scottish Division. Now, they're a formation that we've mentioned quite a lot of times on this podcast. They were the very first Kitchener's Army Division to be formed in 1914 when the so-called first 100,000 was raised. So they were the first 100,000 volunteers into the new army, or Kitchener's Army as it became known because of Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, calling for these volunteers. And it had fought at the Battle of Loos in 1915, suffered horrendous casualties in the attack on the Hohenzollern Redoubt. Its divisional commander had been killed there, Major General Thesiger, and it went on to then fight after the division being reconstituted and some of the units being disbanded or amalgamated. It went on to fight in the Battle of the Somme in 1916, with one of its brigades being replaced by the South African Brigade, 4 battalions of South African infantry that served with the division For example, in the Battle of Delville Wood, and we've done an episode on the Springboks at Delville Wood earlier in the kind of catalogue of the podcast, and go back through it to find that episode. And the brigade commander of the South Africans during the Battle of Delville Wood was Brigadier General Lukin, and he by 1917 had been promoted to become the divisional commander. So there was a South African in charge of the 9th Scottish Division who had won his spurs on the Somme at Delville Wood and gained an incredible reputation. He was very much a hands-on commander. During the Battle of Delville Wood, he'd been in the wood, close to the front line, observing what was going on, and he approached divisional command in a similar kind of way. But of course, a divisional commander, their place wasn't necessarily in the very front line. They were there to command 20,000 men at full strength, and to do that they needed to be a little bit distant from the battlefield to make the right kind of decisions based on the right kind of intelligence. But this attack here on the 9th of April 1917 was his first big battle as a divisional commander. And one of the things that men like Lukin had learnt from 1916 was that artillery was the key to success. It was the king and queen of the battlefield, a phrase we've used many times on this podcast. And it wasn't just the divisional artillery that he had, the field guns, but the heavy guns that was attached to him. Guns from all kinds of calibre that were part of HAG's heavy artillery groups, units of the Royal Garrison Artillery. And this was one of the predominant lessons, that you needed these big guns to smash up German defences, cave in German dugout entrances, take out strong points, destroy the enemy who were defending these positions in front of you, and then use your divisional artillery to lay a creeping barrage in front of your assault troops, and use the shrapnel that can be fired from your field guns to cut the wire. And at Arras, you kind of see some of these lessons and that coming together. It's still being perfected. And if you look at the story of the Battle of Arras, there are many places where the wire is not cut, there's not been enough destruction of the German positions, and there are some pretty hefty casualties. But in this battle, Lukin made sure that the artillery plan was a good one, and that they had a pretty good chance of breaking through the German line and pushing on from Saint-Laurent to Athies and beyond to the Point du Jour, all part of his objectives. And of course, the other element that was now part of the battlefield from a commander's point of view was armoured fighting vehicles, tanks. Tanks had been first used on the Somme, and here in the attack on the 9th of April 1917, 4 tanks were allocated to the 9th Scottish Division, but as was common in the Battle of Arras, they didn't perform particularly well. 2 of the tanks were lost on the start line from artillery fire, a third broke down in no man's land, and the 4th failed to reach its objective when the officer commanding it was killed. So tanks, although they had quite a shock effect on the Somme in 1916, the Germans have reacted to them. They come up with ways of neutralising and even destroying them, and they're not as much of a shock weapon in 1917 as they had been the previous year. So although they can be useful, and there were parts of the Arras battlefield where they definitely were useful, here on Lukin's battlefield, the 9th Scottish Division battlefield, they pretty much had no role whatsoever. The units that were going to make the attack here, again, this was a new way of fighting these kind of battles. Previously, one unit would be given an objective and they would go forward and they'd attack that objective. It might be multiple lines of trenches. And of course, by the time they fought their way through the first objective to the second objective, perhaps to a third objective, there was hardly any of these men left and there was almost no ammunition, and often counterattacks would push them right back and the attack would be a failure. So at Arras, you see leapfrogging of units being used in a big way, where one group of units would take the first objective, others would then pass through them to take the second, others would then pass through all of them to take the third, and it meant that you had fresh troops going forward every time to take the new objective, with other troops behind to act as a battle reserve in case the enemy, the Germans, did attack. So in this ground where we're standing now, in this point between Saint-Laurent and Athies, we are on the ground where the 7th Seaforth Highlanders and the 8th Black Watch took Saint-Laurent in the early phase of the battle, and then the 8th Black Watch pushed on in their advance, taking the Germans by surprise with the barrage having done its job. It overran a regimental command centre, and captured a regimental commander in the process. The 5th Cameron Highlanders and then the 10th Argyll and Southern Highlanders then pushed through the Seaforths and the Black Watch, doing that leapfrogging, and they moved on to the next village. Now, the German trench system around Saint-Laurent was old, well established. There was a secondary line of defence at the next village of Athies, but this was nowhere near as powerful. And beyond Athies, towards the next grouping of villages like Fampoux, and beyond that Rouex, and to the northeast Gavrel, these did have trench systems around them, but again, not as in-depth defences as the very front line. But all of this was open ground in between, with almost no cover, and this was a broad daylight attack as the battle would move forward. So the coordination between artillery and infantry and other arms of service was incredibly important to make sure these units were successful. And here, it wasn't just battalions within that one division of the 9th Scottish Division that was going to advance and then be leapt through in terms of this leapfrogging. Another division was going to come up behind them, the 4th Division, and they were going to carry the advance beyond the Point du Jour, beyond these villages where the Jocks had captured this ground, and continue with the advance, hopefully continue with the advance. And Lukin made sure that his South Africans were heavily involved in this, and they were taking the ground just to the north of Athies as the Camerons and the Argylls pushed through towards the village. The South Africans moved up towards the Point du Jour, that bit of high ground, and then the King's Own Scottish Borders would pass through them, and on the day of battle it would be them that actually captured the very crest of the Point du Jour. And although these objectives were not taken without some loss, this wasn't on the kind of catastrophic scale of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, and the leapfrogging worked, and it meant that units would go forward, fresh units would take new objectives, and gradually the momentum of the advance would continue. So Saint Laurent was taken, Athies was taken, the ground to the north of it was taken by the South Africans, and as we said, the KOSB reached that Point du Jour. Then the 4th Division indeed passed through them all, and they continued with the next phase of the advance in that line between the villages of Gavrel and Fampoux. Beyond the Point du Jour, the ground drops away towards those two villages, and again it's vast open ground then, just as it's vast open ground today, and you can see the potential issues in advance, but that advance went well. And what you see taking place here on the 9th of April 1917 is the largest, the longest British advance in the history of trench warfare up to that point in the conflict. Over 3 miles of ground was taken, and as Lieutenant Colonel Croft, who served in the 9th Scottish Division, later said in his book on the division, one could see half the world, and everywhere one looked there were fleeing Boches. It seemed that for once there had been some success, but although these units advanced a long way, not everyone on their flanks had done the same, and if they continued with their advance, probably as they could have done, their flanks would have been exposed to the Germans north and south of them. So although this was an unprecedented amount of advance and ground captured, it wasn't quite the breakthrough that had been anticipated because of actions to the south around Monchy-le-Preux and in the Scarpe Valley, and to the north, just south of Vimy Ridge, where the Highland Division, the 34th Division, had gone in. But nevertheless, this was a success, and we're looking, in terms of the kind of history of trench warfare, at ground taken with units that could kind of point to the fact that this had been a hugely successful operation for them. And that's important to remember in the history of trench warfare. It wasn't all failure. There were successes like this. It was joining up the dots of that success, working towards an army becoming a modern army, using all of its weaponry in a modern way, which of course we don't really see until the final phase of the First World War in 1918. So that's kind of a bit of history as to where we are. And as we begin our walk and continue down this road, we see to our right a green Commonwealth War Graves Commission sign indicating there's a military cemetery tucked behind some of the modern houses as a path that takes us down to Hervin Farm Cemetery. This has got good views down into the Scarpe River Valley, just to our right, just to the south. And it's a battlefield cemetery started by units of the 9th Scottish Division and some from the 4th Division who leaped through them on that 9th of April 1917 when the advance moved through here to the ground beyond. And an advanced dressing station was set up here because the road that we've just come off of to walk down to this cemetery was a main kind of arterial route, so you could have ambulances set up here for casualties coming off the battlefield to the ADS, the advanced dressing station, treated here and then put into ambulances to take them back to casualty clearing stations either in or beyond the city of Arras. That was the main kind of evacuation route. It was also used as a burial ground for units that were up in the front line beyond the village of Athies, towards Fampoux, towards Gavrelle and towards the Scarpe Valley. It's a small cemetery, and that's one of the things that I like about the battlefields of Arras, because there are many of these small battlefield cemeteries, comrade cemeteries as Martin Middlebrook called them, where men from particular units who had served together are buried together, and there's only 51 graves in here, of which 3 are unidentified. So the vast majority are identified soldiers, so we know who they are, what kind of backgrounds they came from, and then we can discover the history behind their deaths. And one of the things that we find when we come to this cemetery, amongst those 51 graves, are 2 senior officers, one battalion commander and a brigade commander as well. The battalion commander is Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Goss Mullock of the 2nd Battalion, the Essex Regiment, who was killed on the 12th of April 1917. Mullock was a reservist in 1914 who had fought in the Second Boer War. He'd been born in Wales, educated at Halbury College, typical kind of public school background for a regular army officer before the war. His family by 1914 were in Brentwood, and he was called back from the reserve, went to France in 1914, and later he became adjutant of the West Ham Pals, which was a Kitchener's battalion of the Essex Regiment, serving with them on the Somme and being mentioned in dispatches for his bravery in that battle, and then promoted to command the 2nd Battalion, the Essex Regiment, and was killed commanding them on the 12th of April 1917 after he returned from an O group, an orders group, near to the village of Athies on that day. Buried close by is the brigade commander, Brigadier General Charles Gosling, CMG. He was the commander of the 10th Brigade of the 4th Division, one of the brigades that moved forward through the Jocks to continue with the advance beyond. Gosling was an old soldier of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, first being commissioned in 1888, and he too went to France in 1914, but in his case he was an infantry battalion commander then, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Corps. He was wounded at Saint-Éloi, just to the south of Ypres, in February of 1915, when that was very much part of the British line at that particular part of the conflict in Flanders. And he was then appointed, after returning from his treatment in hospital for those wounds, to become the Brigadier General, the Brigade Commander of the 7th Brigade of the 25th Division, which was a new army division. And they came over to the Western Front in the latter part of 1915 and spent a lot of time on the Vimy sector when the British took over the Arras front. And he was wounded again as a Brigadier General when his men were attacked by the Germans in that Vimy sector on the 21st of May 1916, which was a really important date when the Germans blew mines under some of the British positions there. There's a crater in the Canadian Memorial Park called the Broadmarsh Crater, and that is where the Germans blew a mine underneath British troops on the 21st of May 1916, for example. And you'll see in some of the cemeteries close to Vimy, and if you look at the dead that are on the Arras Memorial to the Missing, the memorial that commemorates those with no known grave from this sector from the British Army, you'll see that the 21st of May 1916 is not an uncommon date. So he's already, by 1916, wounded twice, once as a battalion commander, once as a brigade commander, and it kind of shows that Gosling was not a man to sit on his backside away from the battlefield. He was very much a man who led from the front. And in this battle here at Arras in April 1917, his brigade went forward, and a fellow brigadier in the same division was Brigadier General Carton de Wiart VC, someone we've mentioned a few times on this podcast, and we'll come back to him in a little while. His brigade was advancing on the flanks of Gosling's troops. But Gosling himself was killed not on the first day of the battle, but a few days later when he went forward with his brigade major, Captain Hedworth Fellows, previously of the 11th Lancers, and a shell killed Gosling and snipers killed Captain Fellows. So both of them were killed. Fellows was from London, educated at Charterhouse, commissioned in 1911 into the 11th Lancers, and he was attached to the 1st Somerset Light Infantry later on in his military service and got a military cross for a trench raid near Beaumont Hamel in October 1915 when that was a quiet sector of the front. So you've got the brigadier and his brigade major, his right-hand man, buried side by side in this cemetery. Two very experienced, very brave and very forthright officers who always led by example, and like so many in that conflict of the Great War, paid for that example with their lives on the battlefield. So what we see here then is a burial ground where we've got men from a particular time frame, particular units that tell us the story of the fighting in this area. As I often say, these silent cities of the Great War, these war cemeteries, are not there by accident. They're beacons on the landscape that help us understand the events of the past on this modern landscape as we see it today. So we'll leave Gosling and Fellows and the other lads who were buried here, return up that path to the road and continue in the direction of Athies village. It's greatly expanded compared to what it was like in 1914, a fairly small village on the outskirts of the city of Arras, and there's a lot of modern building here and some modern estates. It's quite developed, this part of the Arras battlefield, but you can still trace the path of the Great War. And we're going to walk up through one of the roads with the pathway taking us gradually uphill to Athies Communal Cemetery Extension. So this is next to a civilian burial ground where some of the dead were buried in the 1917 battles, and a bit like the cemetery that we've just come from, this one was started close to another advanced dressing station, so the wounded being brought back from the battlefield were brought to this ADS, set up in this bit of ground here to treat the wounded, assess the wounded, and then prioritise those that needed further treatment and could survive, and then put them in ambulances to get them back to the next phase of medical treatment at the casualty clearing station. Now, although British medical advances and treatment was pretty good, probably one of the best, men still died of their wounds, and that's why you'll always have cemeteries wherever there was any kind of medical facility on the battlefield. So this cemetery was begun in April 1917, used until May 1918, when the front line returned to this area following the German attack in March of 1918 and front stabilised again. A few graves were added in September 1918 following the breakout battles and the final fighting around Arras in that last year of the Great War. And there are now 286 British graves here, 21 South Africans, 1 Australian and 1 German. There are 32 unknowns in the cemetery, so unidentified soldiers, which is about 10% of the burials, which actually is quite low for an Arras cemetery. One of the things that you begin to see as you walk this battlefield and you look at the cemeteries, particularly the post-war created cemeteries where they've searched a wide area and brought in the dead, there's a very high percentage of unknowns. And the Arras Memorial with 35,000 names on it gives us a bit of a hint as to the kind of scale of missing at Arras. And I've mentioned this before, and there's all kinds of reasons for it, but it can be anything from the scale of bombardments and bodies left out on the battlefield to sadly be destroyed by those bombardments in 1917. But there's another factor that I found when I was researching Arras for my book, is that a lot of units were told to get their men to remove all forms of identity from themselves before they went into action. So dog tags were removed, regimental shoulder titles were removed, pay books were handed in, and that meant that when men went into action, they had nothing on them to say who they were. Now, that was fine if they were being retrieved and buried by their comrades who knew who they were, but that wasn't often the case. And if someone came along and found a line of dead soldiers with nothing on them to say who they were, they would be buried as unknown soldiers. So I think that is also a factor here. But in this cemetery, because it's on a battlefield, close to where the fighting was, near to where there was medical facilities, we have a much smaller proportion of unidentified soldiers. So it's unusual in that respect. The other thing you see by kind of looking along the graves, and this is kind of how you read a cemetery, look at the cap badges, look for any kind of commonality, look at dates. And one of the things you see here is a move from infantry casualties, men who have been killed on the battlefield or died of wounds received on the battlefield, to gunner artillery casualties, because as the infantry moved forward and these great advances took place, the guns moved up behind them, because infantry units, by this stage of the conflict, were only as good as the artillery that supported them. So the raw field artillery would move up with their 18-pounders and set up their gun pits in places like this, and as the line moved forward again, and the field artillery moved up to follow those infantry to wherever they were going, the Royal Garrison artillery would move up with their heavier guns and set up their guns in this area. And you see both RFA, Royal Field Artillery, and RGA, Royal Garrison Artillery men buried in this cemetery, reflecting the importance of artillery on the battlefield. And although the infantry often called the gunners 1,000-mile snipers, kind of implying that they were way behind the lines, a lot of the gunner veterans that I interviewed in the 80s and 90s felt hard done by in the way that the infantry had kind of disparaged their service. But you realise the more you study the Great War, how important artillery is, and cemeteries like this, again, a bit like Hervin Farm, acting as a beacon to the story of what's happening there. What we see here is cemeteries like this really indicate the importance of the artillery on these battlefields as well. It wasn't all bayonets and charges and machine guns. The artillery was a vital part of it, and they did not escape their service scot-free. Far from it, when you look at the scale of artillery casualties that you see in many cemeteries from the Great War. And if we look at one particular example of a gunner that's buried in here, and that's Major William Hammond Smith of A Battery, 52nd Brigade Royal Field Artillery. He was educated at Blundell School and then Cambridge, and he was a student of the Royal Academy in London and the Slade School of Art. After leaving university, he became a professional artist, and some of his work is still exhibited in the Guildhall in Cambridge. He volunteered for the Royal Field Artillery in 1914, and he served with them at the Battle of Lewes, and then at Hill 60 and on the Somme, and he rose to command his battery by the time of the Battle of Arras in 1917. And he was doing classic gunner officer work. He was a FOO, a forward observation officer, going forward with the infantry, because at this stage of the conflict, most infantry units had a kind of embedded forward observer with them who could react more quickly to the requirements of the infantry when they came up against particular problems. Germans dug in a trench, called down artillery fire, German strong point the same, and it was a much more successful use and cooperation between these arms of service to achieve victory on the battlefield. So that's what he was doing when he was in action here on the 12th of April 1917, and when he was mortally wounded by a shell splinter while he was carrying out his duties as a forward observer. His colonel later wrote to his family, "I feel his loss very keenly, not only as the loss of a capable officer, but as the loss of a friend whose charming manners had endeared him to all of us, officers and men. No one could have thought less of personal danger than he did, and I cannot help wishing that he had been a little more careful of himself, even at the expense of the observation he was engaged in, for he had been exposing himself fearlessly in an attempt to locate the position reached by our infantry, and this undoubtedly drew the fire which was the cause of his death." So this kind of work was very dangerous and costly. And when we look at cemeteries like this that contain gunners in them, very often we find multiple forward observers having been killed doing this very kind of work, being out there, exposed, reacting to the conditions on the battlefield with the infantry and trying to do their best to help and protect the infantry on the battlefield as they move forward under fire from their enemy. So forward observers, absolutely crucial by this part of the Great War, and we could probably do an entire podcast just about FOOs. Anyway, also in here, of course, are some of those South African graves, And this is not the biggest concentration of South African graves in this area, but it is, again, a bit like the gunner graves, where we can obviously see there's a lot of artillerymen buried together by their cap badges. When we look at the Springbok badge of the South Africans, we can see a grouping of them here, and we know we're on a South African battlefield of the First World War. And the South African Brigade, advancing through the Jocks, who've taken the first area of the battlefield, moved up through this ground where the cemetery now sits on these slopes of this ridge, and they then move towards that high ground of the Point du Jour. So this becomes an important South African battlefield of the First World War. For most people, they just associate the South Africans with Delville Wood, and that is understandable because that was a place of great South African sacrifice in 1916. But the South African story goes right through the First World War on the Western Front, from the Battle of the Somme right through to the final battles of the conflict. And Arras is an important chapter in their history, and something that we see very vividly when we stand amongst the graves of South Africans in a cemetery like this. Leaving the communal cemetery extension behind, we walk through one of those modern housing estates and take a minor road out of the village towards the high ground. We can see quite visibly, and this is one of the great things about walking the ground, is that you can see and appreciate the geography of the landscape today and how that same geography would have affected the events of more than a century ago. And as we come up here, we can see why the Germans are so keen to occupy ground like this, because it increasingly gets higher and higher. As we stop and look back, we've got fantastic views back towards Arras, back towards the Scarp Valley, and we can see how it dominates the terrain in this area. And if we walk up here to a point where the massive electrical pylons cross this road and stop, we're looking at the ground where those South African soldiers whose graves we've just seen, this is where their battalions were advancing on the 9th of April 1917. From our left to our right, in the distance, we can see the very crest of the Point du Jour, and we can see the openness of this ground, which was all part of the issue of advancing here in 1917, and again kind of reflects the importance of the artillery, because the infantry could only advance over ground like this protected by firepower, with guns from the Royal Field Artillery and the Royal Garrison Artillery, and also, of course, from their brigade machine gun companies and the divisional machine gun company laying down suppressive fire, because by this stage of the conflict as well, machine guns are increasingly being used as a kind of artillery to lay down machine gun barrages to enable troops to cross ground just like this. But we can see that this was not any kind of easy advance here in 1917, and with the Germans still holding that high ground of the Point du Jour, until that was captured, this ground could not be properly secured. And ahead of us, where we can see the modern road and the factory units of the industrial estate, that is where the main road that ran from Arras across this high point of the Point du Jour marked a divisional boundary. So we're in the 9th Scottish Division area here. On the other side of that road, the 34th Division were making their advance. That was a division that had fought at La Boisselle on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and had the Tyneside brigades in it, the Tyneside Scottish and the Tyneside Irish, the Grimsby Chums, the 11th Suffolks, the 15th and 16th Royal Scots. It was a unit that seen a lot of action on the Somme in 1916, suffered heavy casualties in that opening phase of the advance, and then gradually been rebuilt until it was ready to take part in an action again, and that action was here on the 9th of April 1917. But returning to the bit of ground where we are in the 9th Scottish Division sector, this is also where the next lot of brigades from the 4th Division, Gosling's men, and also Carton de Weert's men of the 12th Infantry Brigade pass through the Jocks, continuing with that advance towards the villages or the ground between Gavrelle and Fampoux in this next bit of the Arras battlefield. And whenever I come here and walk this bit of the battlefield, looking down towards Fampoux and the ground beyond, I think of George Butler, who I've discussed many, many times on this podcast, who served here as a sergeant in the 12th Machine Gun Company. They were that brigade's machine gun company, and he was here as a number one on a Vickers gun, and his machine gun team passed through pretty close to where we're standing now and moved towards the next bit of the ground. And as they moved towards an area close to what's called the Hyderabad Redoubt, where the Rifle Brigade captured that bit of ground. His machine guns set up in a number of shell holes there, and that became the frontline area. They were the firepower protecting the infantry who had captured that bit of ground on the night of the 9th of April 1917. So on that evening of the first day of the Battle of Arras, in the distance to our right, that's where George Butler's machine guns were, and where he, in that darkness, on that evening, encountered Carton de Weert, who came out of the darkness with a group of officers with him. George Butler thought they might be Germans because they weren't really sure where the Germans were, and as I've described a few times on the podcast, he whipped out his pistol, was about to shoot Carton de Weert and the others when he realised that they were not Germans, they were British. And when they dropped down into his shell hole, he was somewhat surprised to see that this wasn't just any old officer. This was an officer with one eye missing, with an eye patch, one arm missing through previous service, and with a Victoria Cross ribbon on his tunic. And of course, it was Carton de Weert. And there was two regular soldiers looking at each other, realising that they were part of an old army that was almost non-existent now. They were perhaps in their minds, some of the last of those original soldiers from that pre-war army. And Carton de Weert, looking at Butler, who always wore his service dress cap with the stiffener in it, which marked him out as a regular soldier, looked at him and came out with that well-worn phrase, "Thank God when this war's over, Sergeant, we'll get back to real soldiering." And that was George Butler's experience meeting a senior officer out in no man's land on the night of the 9th of April 1917, just across that ground to our right. So we'll continue up this track now, and it takes us further towards the crest of the ridge ahead of us. We can see a lot of indication of the modern world here, this big industrial estate that was developed about 20 odd years ago when they built an industrial area on this part of the Arras battlefield, close to the main road here, and the approach to the motorway, which we can see in the far distance as well. But what we can see as we come up to here is the cairn, the stonework of the 9th Scottish Division Memorial that's here. Now, this is a memorial that originally was on the very crest of the Point du Jour, and it was moved nearly 20 years ago. But why was it placed on the crest of the Point du Jour? Well, the 9th Scottish Division achieved all of its objectives, as we've said, on the 9th of April 1917. It captured all three lines of objectives. It moved through with its leapfrogging, with the Scottish troops and the South African troops capturing the ground, the King's Own Scottish borderers going forward, and they took the very crest of the ridge at the Point du Jour. So it was a place, if they were going to build a divisional memorial, this was their biggest moment, their greatest moment in their history on the Western Front in many ways. And this was the place to build it, but not where it is today, not where we're standing now, close to this fast road and in the shadow of those big industrial units. It was away to our right, further down the road at the very crest of the ridge that we can see on the points, the furthest point the division advanced on the 9th of April 1917. And I'll put a couple of pictures onto the podcast website, one showing the memorial being unveiled and another that I took showing it on its original site in the 1990s, and then one where it is today. And as well as building a memorial there, they also preserved a bit of the battlefield. There was a small section of German trench there that had been captured by the King's Own Scottish borderers on the 9th of April 1917. So it had its own little bit of archaeology too. And this memorial was unveiled on the 9th of April 1922, so on the 5th anniversary of the Battle of Arras, by General Sir William Furze, who had commanded division from after the Battle of Lewes, when Major General Thesiger had been killed, through the Somme until December 1916, when Lukin, the South African, had taken over command of the division. Major General Tudor was also there for the unveiling of this memorial, and he too had commanded division at the time of the armistice in 1918, for example, and there were many other veterans there besides. The memorial was designed as a Scottish stone cairn similar to those at Culloden, for example, and it was surrounded by 19 smaller stone memorials commemorating the different units of the division, and the stone used was Scottish stone, was brought over specially for the creation of the memorial. And for the unveiling ceremony, more than 1,000 people were present, along with pipers from all of the Scottish regiments that had served in the 9th Scottish Division, plus a representation from the French army to, and the newspaper reports at the time quoted this, to honour their Scottish comrades. And the memorial, just like the men in 1917, had achieved its objective because it sat there on that significant high ground of the Point du Jour, marking one of the most significant and remarkable British advances during the trench warfare period of the Great War. So it was an important memorial in all kinds of ways, recording the sacrifice of Scottish and South African troops there in 1917 and memorialising the division for the whole of its war service, but also marking that important turning point in the history of the British Army where you begin to see it fighting modern battles in a modern way and achieving success. It wasn't all lines of infantry moving forward into no man's land just to be mown down by German machine guns. So it sat there for all those years. But what I began to see as the 80s moved into the 90s is the use of the fast road from Arras up to the motorway increased, and it became more and more difficult to pull off of that fast road into the little side road that took you to the memorial where the preserved bit of trench was just in front of it. And when I began to take coaches there, battlefield tours there in the late 1990s, that was particularly tricky to do with a large vehicle like a coach. And it was clear that there was a kind of a ticking clock here. What was going to happen to this memorial site? And as the 90s moved into the early 2000s, this only kind of increased. And a decision was made by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to, rather than change the layout of the road here, which I guess they had no control over, instead they decided to move the memorial to a location where it could be properly maintained and properly accessed. And that was done in the autumn of 2006. In those days, the kind of communication from the Commission was pretty low-key, not like it is today, and it was just moved without any kind of announcement. One day it was there, and then one day it wasn't. And I remember driving up over the ridge, suddenly seeing it on the right, and where it should have been on the left, it was no longer there. And when it was moved, sadly, I don't know who actually moved it, but when it was moved, quite a lot of damage was done to the stonework of the cairn and some of those 19 memorial plaques to the different units that surrounded it. So today, it is in a better location in terms of access. You can't easily drive to it from the main road. You have to come down into Athies and take this minor road up to the memorial site itself, or walk up, as we have done in this virtual walk. But it is protected here, it is safe here, and it's accessible here. And I think some of the damage that was done, some of that work has been remedied over the years since, because, like I say, it's been here now nearly 20 years. But the thing that concerns me really when I come here, and I can't help but think this when I look up to that crest of the Point du Jour, it's now kind of out of context. It's not marking the success that the division had in 1917. It's not on that final objective line. And sadly, that little bit of archaeology, and it was only, a few meters of trench, but come on, this is a landscape where there's almost no visible trenches, and that was really important. And that trench was lost. It was just filled in and abandoned, and that's lost as well. So I think possibly today it probably wouldn't happen. It certainly wouldn't have happened like that during the centenary. And I guess, and I hope, lessons were learned. But I kind of always feel that this memorial, marking this important point in the Great War, this important location on the Arras battlefield, it kind of deserves more than this. But what we've got now is a kind of memorial park here in some respects, because we've got a memorial to a unit and to a battle and to an action. And if we turn to our right, we've got a cemetery as well, the Point du Jour cemetery. So there is a military cemetery here named after that high point on this part of the Arras battlefield. The original cemetery that's here was called Point du Jour Cemetery number 1, and was used from April 1917 until May of 1918. The original cemetery, that Point du Jour number 1, it had 82 burials, and they now form plot 1 in this cemetery, and that's a common practice in all cemeteries that have an original plot and then other graves are brought in. Plot 1 is always the original graves, almost without exception. And then post-war, another 650 burials from the surrounding battlefield were then moved in, and these came from locations like Athies, Saint-Laurent, Gavrelle and Fampoux. So it kind of reflects very much the fighting in this area. There are now 300 British burials from the Great War here, 66 South Africans, 5 Canadians, 2 New Zealanders, and over 400 of them are unidentified, and there are 3 burials from the Second World War here as well. One thing you'll notice when you come into the cemetery are 3 French crosses, so there are 3 French burials here, but a further 44 unidentified French soldiers were moved post-war, and that wasn't uncommon. In British cemeteries, particularly on landscapes like this, where they'd been fighting in the early part of the war, and it's quite likely that the dead that were buried here were casualties from when the French clashed with the Germans in 1914, and either their bodies were found when the British cleared this sector, or it was a small battlefield cemetery that was moved into this when this cemetery was established. But those French soldiers were moved possibly to Notre Dame de Lorette, into one of the ossuaries there post-war. I can't find a record as to which cemetery they were moved to. But many of these British cemeteries on the Arras battlefield did once contain French burials as well, and a few of them still do. We can never forget the French involvement in this part of the battlefield, and nor should we. But the cemetery, the British and Commonwealth graves that are here, reflect the fighting in this area, particularly in April of 1917, with the capture of this ground in the early phase of the battle, the advance over the Point du Jour, and the early assaults towards the villages ahead. Gavrelle, where the Royal Naval Division was, and we've done a podcast about the Royal Marines at Gavrelle in 1917, and then down to our right, the villages of Fampoux, and beyond that, Rouex, where the chemical works was, where unit after unit went into the fight there. And it reflects the divisions that were here in the early phase of the battle, 9th Scottish Division to the right of the road where we're standing now, and those lads from the 34th Division to the north, to the left of the road, and with 66 South African burials. Again, it's a kind of a signpost to the important contribution that those troops had here in the fighting of 1917. In April 2002, so before the removal of the 9th Scottish Division Memorial from the Point du Jour to where it is today, that's when the industrial estate, which we're kind of in the shadow of, that's when that was built. And there were quite a lot of French archaeologists active in this area at that time. Alain Jacques was one of the most famous. He led an archaeological group that did a lot of work on the Arras battlefields during the 90s through to the early 2000s. And they were called up following the discovery of human remains here, where a battlefield burial of men from the Royal Naval Division who'd fought at Gavrelle and from men of the Lincolnshire Regiment were found. Now, these were men who'd not disappeared into the mud. They'd been properly buried. There were lots of newspaper articles about this at that time because the discovery of this many was uncommon then. This is before Fromelles and projects like that. And one of the headlines was they died with their boots on, because the men were found buried side by side with their army boots on, in some cases still with their steel helmets. And what was clear from the insignia that was found with them, that there was one separate plot of men from the Royal Naval Division and then this line of men from the Lincolnshire Regiment. Now, where they were found north of the road, so north of the Point du Jour, this was in the sector where the 34th Division had advanced in the early stage of the Battle of Arras in April 1917. And one of its battalions was the 10th Battalion of the Lincolnshire Regiment, the Grimsby Chums. So it was quite likely that these men were men from that unit, and I think that's pretty much accepted today, 20 years on. And what was interesting when I saw the photographs of this is that it was quite clear that there were kind of separate burial plots, and then one man who was buried separate to the rest, and the artifacts that were found with him indicated that he was probably an officer. So they buried the men together and an officer slightly to one side. Now, at that stage, the forensic approach to identifying the dead found like this on the battlefield was very different to what it is today. So there was no attempt to take DNA or to search for ancestors or any of that kind of stuff that happens now. So these men were buried as unknown soldiers in a separate grave here at the Point du Jour cemetery. But it's pretty convincing when you look at the evidence to see that they are almost certainly casualties from the 10th Battalion, the Lincolnshire Regiment Grimsby Chums, who fell in the advance on Gavrelle in April of 1917. From the cemetery, we'll continue along the final phase of our walk along the edge of the fields up towards that overgrown ground on the very crest of the Point du Jour, now isolated and largely forgotten. This bit of the walk in real life I wouldn't recommend because there's no pathway here and it's a very fast road and you wouldn't want to get kind of caught up in that. But as we're doing a virtual walk, we can kind of get away with this. And it's important to do this in some respects because once we get up to that crest of the Point du Jour, from here we can look back to the cemetery and we can see the white splash of stone in that silent city and once more remember those Grimsby lads. And what it reminds us is that the past on these battlefields, on this landscape of the Great War, the past never stands still. And there's always something new to discover or something yet to be discovered. Beneath these fields, as we look across this vast landscape around Arras, there are so many tales yet to be told. When we look at these fields, what secrets do they hold? What secrets are we seeing from this vantage point across the Arras battlefield? If we look to our left to Vimy and to our right to Monchy, a huge area where that 1917 battle unfolded in April and May of that year. And we ask ourselves, as we do in so many parts of this landscape, what has it left to teach us? What will we discover here? What will we find as we search those pathways of the past along, ever along, that old front line? You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.